I want to talk first about his conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin, in which they discussed both Ukraine and Iran. The president alluded to the fact that Russian President Putin had said he wanted to be a part of the solution when it came to Iranian nuclear enrichment. However, the president said, in fact, he wants to focus more on ending the war with Ukraine.
It happened at 2 a.m., a coded message from the Kremlin that sent the Oval Office into a total meltdown. Putin did not just issue a warning, he delivered an ultimatum that has the Trump administration at a breaking point. Today, we are going inside the room to reveal the leaked details of that confrontation and why Washington is in a state of absolute chaos. Let us begin with what we actually know, because the surface story is dramatic enough. But the real story, the one that insiders are quietly terrified about, is something else entirely. On April 29, 2026, Vladimir Putin picked up the phone and called Donald Trump. Russia initiated the call. Let that land for a moment. It was not the White House reaching out. It was not envoys flying to Moscow with briefcases full of proposals. It was the Kremlin picking up the line, demanding to be heard. And the conversation that followed lasted 1 hour and 30 minutes. 90 minutes of what the Kremlin itself described as frank and businesslike. In the language of diplomacy, frank means there were things said that both sides would rather not repeat publicly. And businesslike means the pleasantries ended quickly and the pressure began immediately. This was not a courtesy call. This was a structured intervention. This was Putin looking at the board, seeing something that alarmed him deeply, and deciding the moment had come to make his position absolutely, undeniably, and publicly clear. Now, here is the first thing you need to understand about this call that mainstream coverage is completely glossing over. This was the 12th phone conversation between Trump and Putin since Trump returned to the White House in early 2025. The previous call had taken place on March 9th. That means there were 7 full weeks of silence between the two men. 7 weeks during which the United States launched sustained military strikes against Iran, during which the war in Ukraine continued to grind forward with Russian forces holding what Moscow describes as the strategic initiative, during which Iran rejected American diplomatic proposals, and during which the fragile ceasefire that exists right now was being actively debated inside Washington's national security apparatus. 7 weeks of silence, and then Putin called. The timing is not a coincidence, the timing is the message. Something in Putin's intelligence picture, or something in the military situation around Iran, convinced the Russian president that letting events unfold was no longer viable. He needed to get on the phone. He needed to say the thing that could not be filtered through back channels. He needed to look Trump in the eye, metaphorically speaking, and deliver a warning that would register at the highest level. Insider reports suggest that the initial moments of the call were characterized by something close to controlled tension inside the White House Situation Room. The senior national security team had been assembled because a call of this nature does not happen casually. There were people in that room whose job it was to listen, to note every word, and to immediately begin assessing the implications of what Moscow was saying. And what Moscow said was not what the optimists inside the administration had been hoping to hear. The ceasefire in Iran is on thin ice. The situation in Ukraine is Russia's to lose, also Moscow believes. And if the United States and Israel make the wrong move, the consequences will be, and this is the word Putin chose, inevitable. Not possible, not regrettable, inevitable. That single word, delivered by the head of a nuclear-armed state directly to the American president, is what sent the energy in that room from tense to something closer to genuine alarm. Let us talk about Iran first, because that is where Putin concentrated the sharpest edge of his message. The United States has been at war with Iran since late February of this year. The military campaign has been devastating in its conventional impact. Iran has lost the overwhelming majority of its naval capacity, its air defense systems have been systematically degraded, its air force has been reduced to a fraction of what it was. Trump himself, speaking to reporters after this call, described Iran's military situation bluntly, saying that with no navy, no air force, and no anti-aircraft apparatus remaining, it is hard to make the case that Iran is doing well militarily. He is not wrong about the military dimension, but here is the problem that military historians will recognize immediately. Destroying a country's military infrastructure is not the same thing as achieving a political objective. The United States has spent roughly $25 billion on the Iran war since it began, and Iran has not capitulated. Iran has not agreed to dismantle its nuclear program on American terms. Iran rejected on that very same day the latest American proposal regarding the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade remains in place. The political result that the administration needs has not materialized. And Putin, watching all of this with calculating patience, saw that gap between military success and political resolution and drove his message directly into it. Putin told Trump that he welcomed the decision to extend the ceasefire with Iran, framing it as a step that could create space for negotiations and help stabilize a volatile situation. That was the diplomatic grace note at the opening of his Iran argument. But then came the core of what he had to say, and this is the part that insiders described as the moment the temperature in the room changed. Putin warned of what he called inevitable and extremely damaging consequences, not only for Iran and its neighbors, but for the entire international community, if the United States and Israel resort to force again. And then, in an even more specific formulation that took analysts by surprise, Kremlin advisor Yuri Ushakov confirmed that Putin told Trump directly that any renewed military action, and particularly any ground operation on Iranian territory, would be dangerous and unacceptable. The specific mention of ground operations is the part that sent alarm bells ringing across Washington's foreign policy community, because that level of specificity does not come from nowhere. When a Russian president singles out ground operations in a country where there is currently a ceasefire, it means Russian intelligence has seen or heard something concrete. It means the Kremlin has assessed with enough confidence to stake its diplomatic credibility on the claim that a ground component to the Iran campaign is being actively discussed at a level of seriousness that demands a direct response. Whether or not a ground operation is actually imminent is a separate question. The point is that Putin believed it was real enough to address it explicitly by name in a one-on-one call with the President of the United States. And that belief, whether justified or not, is itself a fact with enormous strategic consequences. Now here is where the analysis gets genuinely complex, because Putin did not only come with warnings, he also came with an offer. He told Trump that Russia would like to be involved in securing Iran's enriched uranium, offering Moscow as a potential custodian or intermediary for Iran's nuclear material, a role Russia played in the 2015 nuclear agreement. By making this offer, Putin was doing several things at once. He was signaling that Russia has a working relationship with Tehran that Washington does not currently have. He was inserting himself into the resolution architecture of the conflict in a way that would make Russia indispensable to any deal. He was presenting Moscow not as a spoiler, but as a constructive partner. And he was doing all of this while simultaneously delivering warnings about inevitable consequences if the military option is pursued further. Trump's response to the enrichment offer is one of the most revealing moments of the entire episode. He rebuffed it. He told Putin, and then repeated this publicly in the Oval Office, that he would much rather have Russia focus on ending the war in Ukraine than get involved with Iran's nuclear material. That response is politically smart in the short term. It pivots the conversation away from an offer the administration was not ready to accept, and it ties Russian engagement to the Ukraine question, where the administration needs to show progress. But it also confirms something important. By redirecting Putin's energy toward Ukraine, Trump essentially acknowledged that Russia is a necessary party to the Ukraine resolution. And by making that linkage explicit out loud on camera, he confirmed that these two conflicts are no longer being handled in separate diplomatic lanes. They are connected. The price of Russian non-interference in Iran is Russian cooperation on Ukraine. That is the deal structure emerging, whether the administration uses those words or not. And yet here is where the chaos inside the administration becomes fully visible, because the Ukraine picture from Russia's side of this call was anything but encouraging. While Trump was projecting optimism while he was telling reporters that a solution would come relatively quickly, the Russian readout told a fundamentally different story. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov made clear that Putin stressed something no one in Washington's peace camp wanted to hear, that Russia's goals in Ukraine would be achieved in any case, not that Russia hoped they would be achieved. In any case. That is language of absolute certainty. That is Putin telling Trump in a conversation both sides described as warm and businesslike, that Russia is going to get what it came to Ukraine to get, and no amount of diplomatic pressure from Washington is going to change that fundamental equation. For the senior members of the Trump national security team listening to this readout, there had to be a reckoning with a deeply uncomfortable reality. The administration has been engaged in active diplomacy around Ukraine for over a year. There have been meetings, proposals, and conversations at every level, and the result is that Russia is still advancing, still holding the strategic initiative on the ground, still publicly stating its objectives will be achieved regardless, and still offering only a Victory Day ceasefire tied to its own domestic political calendar, rather than any genuine movement toward a settlement that Kyiv could accept. The Victory Day ceasefire proposal deserves particular scrutiny because it is being presented in some quarters as a genuine peace gesture. On May 9th, Russia celebrates the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in 1945 with its most important military parade. This year, that parade is being scaled back because Russia is worried about Ukrainian retaliatory strikes. And yet in the same breath, Putin proposed a ceasefire for those exact days as a gesture of goodwill, and Trump publicly supported the initiative. Let the internal contradictions settle in. Russia is reducing its own parade because it fears Ukrainian strikes, while simultaneously proposing a ceasefire for those same days and framing it as diplomacy. What that actually means strategically is that Russia wants the optics of a ceasefire without the substance of one. It wants to protect its parade while earning American endorsement of that framing. Insider reports suggest that the reaction within parts of the national security apparatus to Trump's enthusiastic public endorsement of this proposal was more complex than the press conferences suggested. There is a contingent within the administration that believes any ceasefire framework, even a symbolic one, gives Moscow exactly what it wants: a pause to regroup, resupply, consolidate gains, and resume operations from a stronger position. And then came the detail that almost slipped by entirely in the noise of everything else. Trump told reporters that something had happened near Putin's residence during or around the time of this call. He mentioned it almost in passing, but the detail is extraordinary. Something occurred near the Russian president's physical location, significant enough to be raised at the presidential level. American officials moved quickly to indicate they did not believe it was a Ukrainian strike. But the very existence of this incident occurring during a phone call between the two leaders at a moment of maximum geopolitical tension across two simultaneous conflicts is not a footnote. It is a data point that intelligence agencies around the world are examining very carefully. In the immediate aftermath of the call, Trump announced he would waive sanctions on oil from certain countries to boost supply and bring down energy prices. This is a direct economic consequence of the conversation, and it tells you something important about the domestic pressure the administration is operating under. The war in Iran, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the instability in energy markets driven by two active conflicts, these are not geopolitical abstractions, they have price tags. They show up at the gas station, they are political liabilities, and the fact that Trump's first concrete policy announcement after the call was an energy-related sanctions waiver tells you the administration is acutely aware of the domestic economic dimension of these conflicts and is looking for every lever available to demonstrate control of a situation that is becoming increasingly difficult to control. Now let us talk about the real geopolitical consequences, because this is where the long game analysis lives. What Putin accomplished with this call goes far beyond the immediate content of the conversation. By initiating the call, by delivering specific warnings about Iran while making an offer that inserts Russia into the resolution framework, by holding firm on Ukraine while endorsing a symbolic ceasefire that serves Russian interests, and by having his aide brief reporters in extraordinary detail about everything said, Putin executed a masterclass in multi-domain signaling. He sent one message to Tehran: Russia has spoken directly to the American president on your behalf. You are not alone. He sent another message to Kyiv and to Europe: Russia is engaged diplomatically at the highest level, and whatever you are hoping the Americans will do to change the situation, Moscow is actively working to prevent it. He sent a third message to the broader international community: Russia is not isolated. Russia is a necessary party to every major resolution being discussed anywhere on the globe right now. Every element of that performance was calibrated, none of it was accidental. There is also a much larger story being missed in how most analysts are framing the Iran dimension of this call. When Putin warns about inevitable consequences from resumed military action against Iran, he is not simply expressing humanitarian concern or invoking international law. He is protecting a strategic relationship that has been fundamental to Russia's military capacity in Ukraine. Iran supplied Russia with drones. Iranian drone technology, adapted and deployed by Russian forces, has been one of the defining features of the Ukraine conflict in its later phases. The relationship between Moscow and Tehran is operational. It is a supply chain relationship with direct consequences on the battlefield. An Iran whose government is removed or whose strategic capacity is dismantled on Washington's terms is an Iran that can no longer serve as a military partner for Russia. That is an enormous strategic loss for Moscow, entirely independent of whatever happens to the regional order. Putin's defense of Iran cannot be understood separately from this reality. The Trump administration's challenge in responding to all of this is the kind of strategic dilemma that keeps people in the Situation Room awake at night. The administration cannot credibly threaten Russia with severe consequences over Ukraine while needing Russian non-interference over Iran. It cannot reject Putin's enrichment offer while keeping the door open to Russian involvement in a final Iran settlement. It cannot project unilateral American strength across two simultaneous military theaters while the Russian president is publicly warning about the consequences of exactly that posture. These contradictions are structural, and they are not going to be resolved by a single phone call or a single round of diplomacy, no matter how warm the atmosphere at the end of the conversation reportedly was. What happened on April 29, 2026 was a moment of crystallization, a moment when the competing pressures, the military realities, the diplomatic contradictions, and the strategic dilemmas all converged in one 90-minute conversation between two men who hold enormous power and who see the world in fundamentally different ways. Putin came to that call knowing exactly what he wanted to accomplish. He wanted to put Washington on notice about Iran. He wanted to demonstrate Russian indispensability. He wanted to lock in a ceasefire proposal that protects Victory Day without conceding anything on Ukraine. And he wanted all of it said publicly enough that no one could later claim they did not know where Russia stood. Whether Trump and the team around him have the clarity and strategic coherence to navigate what comes next is the central question of this moment in history. The chaos in Washington is real. The pressure is real. The stakes are real. And the warning from the Kremlin, delivered not through intermediaries but in 90 minutes of direct and frank dialogue, is as real as it gets. This is not a bluff designed to be called. This is a position staked out by a leader who believes he is winning, who believes time is on his side, and who has just told the most powerful man in the world, directly and without ambiguity, that there are lines he is not willing to watch crossed. So here is the question I want you to sit with and answer in the comments below. Was Putin's warning about the consequences of resumed military action against Iran a genuine strategic red line that the Trump administration has to factor into every decision it makes from this point forward? Or was it calculated theater, a bluff from a country already stretched thin by its own war in Ukraine, designed to protect Russia's position without any real commitment to follow through? And do you believe this administration has a credible path to ending both of these wars in a way that actually serves American interests and produces genuine stability? Or are we watching in real time the early stages of an overextension that historians will look back on as the moment the complexity of the board finally exceeded the strategy being applied to it? Drop your answer in the comments. Share this with someone who thinks they already understand what happened yesterday, because I promise you there is far more to this than the headline. And if you want analysis that goes inside the room and does not stop at the surface, subscribe now, because the next chapter of this story is already being written.